I want to start by this question today. What would a unified world look like? I think when we think about that, we initially go to utopia. I just thought of an old drink called Fruitopia for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know if that's always the outcome, utopia. I certainly don't think our world is unified today, but it's true that our world is becoming smaller. Globalization, air travel, free trade, social media, a smartphone in every hand. There's no doubt that the speed of society has increased, and the potential for a message to travel has surpassed anything we have ever seen before. We're definitely beyond carrier pigeons and the Pony Express. There was a time when a U.S. president had to go through a strategy of how to get a message out to his people. I know that's foreign today because our president can tweet, and I can see it before CNN does. That's just how Twitter works. It's amazing to think that he can send a message right to a normal person. And, 2 minutes, it can be Facebook, and 5 minutes, it's a push notification on my phone, and 10 minutes, live news is covering it, 30 minutes, worldwide. Just a thought that goes through a world leader's head. Maybe you have heard of the yodeling kid from Walmart. AJ, throw us up there. There he is. Anybody who knows who this is? All right. So this kid lives in a small town in Illinois, and the biggest thing going in that town is Walmart. Maybe you guys have been in a town like that. So he would regularly go down to the Walmart, stand by the registers or by the rotisserie chickens, I don't know, and start just singing some classic Hank Williams Sr. songs that included the yodeling part. You guys know what yodeling is, right? You don't need a demonstration? No, you don't. Okay. No, you don't want one. And so somebody one day just videoed this kid, put it on YouTube, and it blew up like mad. I don't understand. No one understands why things go viral. But pretty soon it began being in like trap remixes and dubstep. The bass drops and this kid's exploding with Armageddon behind him. And within probably 2 weeks, he was on Ellen DeGeneres, he was at Coachella, and he was at the Grand Ole Opry in 2 weeks. 2 days ago, he released an actual Apple Music single. Like, you can get it right now under Mason Ramsey and hear it. It is professionally done. Do you know how long it takes to get studio time? Think about this. In April, this month, he was yodeling in a Walmart on YouTube. And now he has an Apple single out. I got one more. If that wasn't funny enough for you. Far less important on a national scale, I might add. But funnier to me. There was a youth golfer named Isaac Cooling this past Wednesday. He did not know that in the next few hours he would become the viral flavor of the week. No one ever knows before this national epic fail. So Isaac was golfing near Blissfield, Michigan, in a school tournament when he came upon a very territorial Canadian goose. Now, we know about these in Fort Collins. They are everywhere. I've never been chased by one. I'm sure somebody here has. Suddenly, the goose attacks. Now, he begins to run away. I know all of us have different ways of responding to things like that. I would think that I would take the golf club out and go do something like that. But we all respond differently in those situations. But Isaac makes the mistake that everyone in every horror movie ever makes, and he falls down while running. And so, this looks bad enough. You might think this is really bad, but the goose is not simply destroying this man's life in the moment. He wants to destroy his life forever, and forever get rid of the possibility that he would have a girlfriend. And so, show the next picture. I don't even know how this happens. What is happening? Like, this looks terrible. How do you survive from something like that? Just socially. I don't understand. But, we can say it could happen to anybody, but I don't think it could happen to anybody. So, anyway, take that picture down, please. Think about the world in which we live, where an unimportant high school golfer in Michigan is on my TV screen as I'm drinking my morning coffee and watching the news, just an hour after it happens. Think about that. A pointless story can travel across the world in seconds. Think about the ability for something truly important to change the world. Think about the potential for evil to spread that quickly. So this was the reality of the city that housed the Tower of Babel. And we will see that the people of the world had gathered in one place with one name to build one tower, but without the guiding presence of God. What could be accomplished in a society like that? Good? Maybe. Evil? Absolutely. Man had built a system that defied the command of God and relegated him to the ashtray of necessity. And today I want to analyze exactly what was the sin of Babel. Why would God concern himself with it? I want to look at the motivations of why mankind would build such a structure in a city. I want to help you understand why we see cultures and nations and languages in our world. But most of all, I want a theme to run throughout this message. Think of this as the subtext behind the message, okay? As I explain the details of this story, I want you to think, which tower am I building in my life? And so I've titled this The Two Towers, with no plan of a Lord of the Rings reference whatsoever. I think that's enough. But I want to make sure that the tower that you give your life to building actually does reach into the heavens and is not built upon your vain ambitions, as was the tower at Babel. And so the question is, what tower are you building? The tower that's built on Christ and his accomplishments, or one of vanity and self-accomplishment? Man's accomplishments will never be the centerpiece of God's universe. Our sovereign God will always humble the proud and accomplish his purposes to the ends of the earth. And so this is probably one of the more dense messages that I've had in a while. I've been missing them and waiting on them to return to me. And so here we are. Let's begin by praying. Father, I just ask now that you would help me speak clearly about your truth. And Lord, that your Spirit would fall in this place, open our hearts to you. Lord, take me out of this picture and allow you to speak clearly. In Jesus' name, amen. So every good sermon should start with the Bible. Let's do that. Genesis 11, 1 and 2 is where we'll be. Feel free to grab one of those Bibles laying around you. Turn there. I'll have it on the screen as well. Genesis 11, 1 and 2. It says this: Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So we're going to begin with what I call a complicated problem. There's a lot of factors going on here. So that's number one, a complicated problem. I think the best thing for me to do initially is to cut right to the issue that's a problem here, because our ears, when we read this story, we don't always pick up the issue. You have one people group with one language living in one area with no desire to spread out to the earth. Now, why is that a problem? Two separate times, God told mankind to be fruitful and multiply and what? Fill the earth, right? We love to be fruitful and multiply for obvious reasons, but we sometimes forget the fill the earth part. Am I right? So he said it in Genesis 1:28, fill the earth. The next time God told this to Noah was in Genesis 9:1, fill the earth. Now, as far as chronology goes, the Tower of Babel does not happen long after the flood. I don't know what you thought coming in, but it really doesn't even happen after Genesis 10. It's somewhere in between the genealogy of Genesis 10 is when the time period occurs. And so our best time marker for Babel occurs in just a little nugget we have in Shem's genealogy in Genesis 10:25. So I'll put that up on the screen for you. It says this: To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. So, fun fact, Eber is the name where the word Hebrew comes from. I don't know if you ever wondered where, but that guy's name is where the word Hebrew comes from. But anyway, more importantly, you see that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Now, if that means what it sounds like, his lifetime is our time marker for Babel. It could only have been then between 100 and 200 years after the flood. Now, for those of you that are really good at math, Noah lived, 350 years after the flood? Which means Noah was alive at Babel. Now, let's talk about the location and the meaning of Shinar. I promised Stacy I wouldn't say it, but Quinn fell, and on her face, she got a Shinar. There. Had to do it. The plains, the plains of Shinar occur in the Old Testament, always associated with Babylonian territory. Okay? You should always think Shinar, Babylon. Okay? This is not a good thing for the Old Testament reader. You come to understand that Babylon is the mortal enemy of Israel. It is the Thanos, if you will, of the Avengers. And a symbolic idol worship immorality symbol. Okay? We are told in Daniel 1:2 that the Babylonians took Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the land of Shinar. Okay, so there it is again. This connection lasts a long time. So look back again at Genesis 10 for one more little nugget that I think you'll enjoy. Genesis 10, 8 through 10. I'll put it on the screen. Another genealogy, this time Ham's. It says, Cush fathered Nimrod. Man, aren't you glad that's not your name? Somebody say amen. And he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That must have been a phrase people knew. The beginning of his kingdom was, what? Babel. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and then there was some other big kingdoms as well in the land of Shinar. Now, I used to have a football coach that called me Nimrod. Chris, get over here, Nimrod. That was what I always used to hear, and I didn't have the courage in those days to say, actually, Coach Smith, Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. But, maybe I should have. Probably good I didn't. So, very possible that Nimrod was a powerful man that orchestrated the building of Babel. We know that he was mighty and that he had a kingdom that included at least 3 great dynasties in that list. We see the Babylonians, the Akkadians, and the Assyrians. Those are 3 massive empires. And so this kind of resume makes the Tower of Babel built by Nimrod much more realistic. And so, as I said earlier, the main surface level problem of Babel, this is probably what you want to write down, the actual problem on the surface of Babel was the failure to disperse and spread and fill the earth. Okay? That's the basic surface level sin of Babel. They did not fill the earth. God said to, bada boom, sin. And God's design was that man spread and exert his dominion over the whole earth, and that his image bearers would inhabit the earth. However, the desire of man is often contrary to God. So, why would it be a bad thing? I think these are good questions to think about. Not that we're questioning God at all, but why would it be a bad thing for man to be gathered in one place with one language? Well, I think it's pretty easy if you think about it historically. Consider the ability of one persuasive dictator to rise and distort the masses towards evil. Hitler's Germany and the Third Reich was going to take over the world and convert the earth into one unified Germany with Adolf Hitler as the Nimrod. Okay? So, why didn't that happen? Well, Winston Churchill rather liked his freedom. The United States of America, we rather liked our freedom. And so, God's design for nations and people groups are a means of common grace to the earth to protect against a unified evil. One country can't just do anything forever. Eventually, people and empires rise and fall, and this is actually God's grace to humanity. So, in Babel, the stage was set for a world ruler, one from the leader's chair with easy communication and language, from one location in direct defiance to God's command. And thus we get to the second major point. We see, number 2, a familiar perspective. A familiar perspective. When you read Genesis, you often think, I feel like I've been here before. And that's a good thing. That means you're actually reading it correctly. So let's pick up with our reading in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 11. It says this, And they, that's the builders, said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Man, there's a lot in here. So first we get an idea of what they were trying to build. This was a tower that resembles something that we know from ancient history called a ziggurat. It's a fun word. It's It's actually the first name on Ziggy Marley's birth certificate. Ziggurat Marley. Just kidding. It's not real. Okay. It was a tall building with a staircase appearance made popular by Babylonians. We know that's true. And so sometimes they would even paint the top of this ziggurat blue to appear as if it actually was touching the sky. So looking from the ground, looking up, it would have the appearance of reaching the heavens. We know, of course, it didn't. Secondly, we know why they were trying to build. The end of verse 4 clearly states they wanted to avoid being dispersed. It says, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. And there's no doubt in that their motivation was rebellion against God's will. God says, spread out and fill the earth. That's what we call rebellion. Absolute rebellion. And what interests me is that they know it is. You don't say the consequence to avoid unless you know that it has been told to you not to do it. And so they are aware that they are being rebellious. So I think there's another element in play to rebellion. Does anybody see in this story just a tinge of pride, maybe, on the part of the builders? There's a lot of let us. There's a lot of for ourselves in there. I believe that's intentional. And verse 4 tells us they were looking to make a name for themselves. Now, it is no accident that in Genesis 12, God promises a great name, a great nation, and a great blessing to Abraham and his descendants, because it is purposely designed to contrast with the foolishness of Babel, that man can grant those things to himself. So God says one chapter later, hey, I'm going to break you up, and I'm actually going to give all those things you wanted to one guy and tell him his family is going to carry on what you wish you had. And so rebellion and pride, we know that they're a deadly combo. One, the reader of Genesis should be well acquainted. Satan rebelled because of his pride, entered a serpent. Adam and Eve rebelled against God's command because they were promised they could be like him. Cain rebelled against God's preference of Abel's offering. The entire world except Noah and his family rebelled against God in wickedness. Ham rebelled against his father, Noah, by dishonoring him to his brothers. I could spend the next hour giving you Bible examples of this. It goes on and on and on. But my guess is you have experienced rebellion in your own life towards God. How many times have you had to stop, recalibrate, recalculate, and reassess your motives for living life the way you do? How often do you step back and realize that you are far more motivated by your pride and accomplishments than you would ever want to admit? Our entire economic system is based upon acquiring more than the Joneses and rubbing it in their face. It's the gasoline in the engine that produces wealth. And I want you to know, I have taken macro and microeconomics, and I do believe capitalism is the most effective way to create wealth and reward hard work and lift people out of poverty. So don't hear me saying anything negative about this system. I believe it's the best one. However, every system has collateral damage. Communism gives undue power to a government to steal from people and to de-incentivize work. And that's just the tip of those problems. Capitalism's great weakness, however, is this, and this is what we need to be careful of. If you don't have a pre-existing moral compass to ground you, then you can become saturated with greed and the desire to have more and more and more. And this is the cycle that many of us unintentionally find ourselves in. You see, the scriptures paint this picture that there are really only ever two options: God's way and the world's way. The spirit, the flesh, the light, the dark, the broad path, the narrow path, the sheep, the goat, the wheat, the tares, you get it. Okay? Now, in this spirit, I would like to present to you that there really are only two towers in this world. There's the principle of the Tower of Babel, built upon pride, vain ambition, rebellion, personal accomplishment, and building a name for yourself. This tower is consumed with self, and God is avoided. There's no discussion of the glory of God, the fame of Christ, the pursuit of holiness. The tower represents man's best attempt to reach heavens, but not to find God, so that people on the ground would marvel at the accomplishments of man. The great irony in the Tower of Babel is that even the greatest skyscrapers in our world don't come close to reaching heaven. And so it is actually doomed to fail from the first brick. And yet, we try. Now, there is another tower, one that I could tell you about, or I think it would be more fun if I showed you. I like to turn some pages now. Our first glimpse of this tower is revealed to Jacob in Genesis 28. Except it's not actually called a tower. I wish it was, but it's called a ladder. So if you want to look with me at Genesis 28:10, I want to show you something I found really cool. I'll have this on the screen. I'm going to read this passage for you. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head. He needs a MyPillow. And lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth. And the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, angels of God were ascending and descending. I want y'all to say real quick for me, out loud, ascending and descending. Okay. Put that in there, okay? And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and the south. And in you your offspring shall be blessed. This is just Abraham's promise to Jacob. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave until I have done what I have promised. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is where we get the word Bethel from, the house of God. And this is the gate of heaven. So what we have here, God appears to Jacob in a dream. There's a great ladder that stretches from heaven to earth. And the word for ladder is actually staircase. I will write my letter to the editor later. That is what Babel was shaped like. It was a staircase that reached to the top. At the top of this ladder in Jacob's dream, the Lord is there. He identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob sees angels ascending and descending on the ladder, symbolizing that this staircase is how heaven touches earth. Jacob wakes up and calls this place the gate of heaven. Now, I'll do you one better. Turn with me to John 1:47. John chapter 1:47. I will put it up on the screen as well. This is Jesus calling some of his initial disciples. John 1:47 says this. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said, behold, an Israelite indeed, who there is no deceit. But Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, you were under the fig tree. I saw you. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered him and said, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, you believe? You'll see greater things than these. And he said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Somebody say ascending and descending. Now, first time, Jacob's dream has it being a ladder going from heaven to earth. Jesus shows up and immediately says, I am the tower. I am the ladder between heaven and earth. If you want to build a tower that reaches into the heavens, look no further. I am the tower. So friends, we are back at the original question. There are two towers in this world. Are you trying to build your life into the tower that is built upon rebellion, pride, and reaches a few couple hundred feet off of the ground? Or are you building your life on Christ, the true tower built by God that reaches down to us and makes heaven available to us? Babel's way was built by bricks and the human will to have a great name for the self. God's way was built by the wood and nails of a cross, by a carpenter named Jesus. In complete humility and obedience, he bridged the gap between heaven and earth. And in him is a heavenly city greater than Babel could ever imagine. And he is the chief cornerstone of this structure. And we are made into living stones to contribute to the kingdom of God. Now, I hope you see the awe and the wonder of the tower that God built for us compared to the foolishness of Babel. Don't waste another day building your own Tower of Babel in vanity. God has already built our tower, and he's calling us to build our life into Jesus. Now, we have a couple more verses to conclude this story. God does respond to this rebellion. I would say, compared to the flood, in light of recent events, this is a pretty gracious punishment. And that's my third point. Number 3, we see a gracious punishment. A gracious punishment. So look at verses 5 through 7. We'll read those together. Genesis 11:5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So I want you to notice the language that is essentially mocking the builders at Babel. First, the Lord has to come down to see the tower. So that's a cue right there. Obviously, a language that suggests this tower is so small that God has to come down to see it because it did not reach into the heavens. And secondly, I think you'll notice the builders say, let us make bricks, let us make a name, let us this and that. And God invokes the divine plural and says, let us go down. And this is definitely a wordplay to increase the poetic value and to poke a little bit of fun at the builders. So, another thing that you might be concerned about. People often read into verse 6 something that is not there. Typically, the modern reader understands when you read the story of Babel for the first time, I think the average reader thinks God is just sitting up there going, oh man, I better get down there and do something because who knows what those guys will be able to do soon. And I think that's how people read the story. First of all, let's just consider that God just flooded the entire earth and destroyed it 2 chapters ago. So do you really think God is concerned about losing power to the grasshoppers? No. He speaks and planets appear. This is not the correct reading. A better way to understand this would be, if I don't intervene, then they will actually be able to carry out the terrible things that they plan to do. And as I said earlier, the design of the nations and peoples is an earthly way for God to mitigate against evil in this world. And as soon as this happens all the time. As soon as the Assyrians got really big and scary, the Babylonians came. And then as soon as they did, the Medo-Persians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. You get the picture. No one empire can rule for too long before somebody else comes bigger than they are. And so God's plan is to ruin the plans of Babel. Now, given what God has just done, that he's flooded everything and killed everyone, the reader is prepared for anything. We're ready for lightning, or we know Sodom and Gomorrah is coming, and so maybe he's going to use the fire and the brimstone. We don't know what he's going to do here. And so we're kind of prepared for, all right, God, what are you going to do to these people? Turns out it's actually not that bad, what he does. Nobody even dies. So here's another example of God's grace for you. Prophetically said, I might add. You have, I don't know how it went, but I would imagine it went something like this. 2 guys are building the tower. They're chopping things. They're hitting things with big sticks and whatnot. And one of the guys says, hey, Meshach, grab me a couple of those bricks over there. Meet me by the altar. And next time I tell you to do something, espero que hold on. And everyone's just like, what just happened? And all of a sudden, he starts talking back in German. He starts talking back in French. And everybody's freaking out. What is happening here? Why can't I understand anyone? And then boom, immediately, the project ended. It was over. They were so shocked, they could not figure out what was going on. And considering all possible punishments, when you think about it, I think it's fair to say God was very gracious here to a society that was saved them from the flood. We have seen grace after grace after grace in the first few chapters of Genesis, every punishment laced with grace. Even in this punishment, we see that God's ultimate good was to protect humanity from a terrible one-world dictator with a terrible name, Nimrod. Verse 7 says, God confuses the language of the people. Now, the Hebrew word behind this confusion word is where we get the word Babel. I know it's often said, it's called the Tower of Babel because afterwards everyone was like, Babel, Babel, Babel. No, that's not true. It literally comes from the Hebrew word behind confusion. And it also has a connection to the god Baal and to just the word Babylon. You'll notice they're all very similar. That's because they come from the same root word. And so from this confusion, people spread all over the earth. It's not clear whether God, pulled like a Age of Empires kind of thing, where, roller coaster tycoon, where you just move people all over the planet, or if the natural function of them speaking different languages made them separate. I think the literal plain reading is that he moved them, and that probably happened in Acts chapter 8 with Philip and after the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. But anyway, the point is that they did not finish the building project. There was not one unified people in the world. God forcibly ended that and forced people to be sent out and forced the obedience to his original command to fill the earth. Now, I would like to point you to one last comparison as we finish up this passage. It may seem a little weird at first. Hang in there with me. We're going to look at verses 8 and 9 as we finish this passage. Genesis 11:8 says, "So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. They left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth." The last point I want to make to you is that we see, number 4, a picture of Pentecost. A picture of Pentecost. Now, earlier I made this comparison between the 2 towers that you can build in your life. One is your own achievements and accomplishments that draws attention to yourself. The men of Babylon tried this. They left confused and speaking different languages, and they abandoned the work. There is a New Testament parallel to this story, except these people were building their tower into Christ. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the story of Pentecost, but I'm sure someone is not, so I will share it briefly with you. If you want to read this on your own, it's in Acts chapter 1 and 2. So Jesus had died and was resurrected. The scriptures tell us he walked around in his resurrected body for about 40 days, teaching his disciples on the kingdom, making a few guest appearances. And on the 40th day, he told his disciples that the Spirit would soon come in power and that they would be witnesses to the ends of the earth. That's Acts 1:8. He told them, wait here. There's going to be a power that comes, and then you'll be my witnesses. So Jesus then ascended into heaven. The tower built by God was complete. 10 days had passed, and the disciples were waiting and praying in the upper room. So this is 50 days since Jesus had resurrected, thus the prefix Penta in Pentecost, thus 50 days Pentecost. That's what that means. So suddenly, a great wind comes from heaven. Tongues of fire fill the room. The disciples stood up and they walk outside. They all began just praising God publicly and loudly. And there were people from all over the world that were in town because the Passover had just occurred. And so there was a representation of people groups and languages from all over, Jews that were scattered, that came to Jerusalem for this Passover. And something miraculous happened. They began to hear the praises of God on these Galilean lips in their own language. Okay, so Peter and John and James and all those guys, they were standing up and preaching in their language, and it was heard in another language. That's the miracle of tongues. And so all this chaos begins, and then Peter stands up, delivers a message, calls the crowd to repent of their sin, put their faith in Jesus, build their life on his teaching. 2,000 are saved that day. That's Pentecost. So what? Big deal, right? No, not really. The day of Pentecost is the scriptural anti-Babel. And whereas man was the failed hero of Babel, Jesus is the true hero of Pentecost. You see, at Babel, all were gathered together in one place from one location. At Pentecost, all were gathered together in multiple languages from multiple locations. The desire of Babel was to make a great name for the self. The desire of Pentecost was to make a great name for Jesus. Those at Babel were disobedient because they failed to disperse and fill the land. Those at Pentecost were obedient because they gathered and waited on the Lord. God punished those at Babel by confusing their language and prohibiting communication. God blessed those at Pentecost by allowing one language to be heard by multiple listeners, thus clarifying and magnifying the communication. At Babel, the tower was never completed because the builders gave up. At Pentecost, people took the message of the gospel back to their hometowns all over the world, and the work had just begun. Church, you can build your life on the Tower of Babel, chasing your dreams and seeking to magnify yourself, but know that in time, God will come down and confuse all of your efforts. Man's accomplishments will never be the centerpiece of God's universe. Our sovereign God will always humble the proud and accomplish his purposes to the ends of the earth. However, if you build your life into the tower that Jesus built, the one that reaches from heaven to earth, if you humble yourself, if you seek to magnify Jesus' accomplishments, you will be exalted with him and raised to an imperishable glory. Now think about your life today. Is the effort of your life being spent building Babel all over again? If so, I hope you will turn away from that sin today. Confess it to God in prayer.